Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 90th video in our Master Series, 90th, and our 4th video in our subgroup mixing. I certainly hope I made it very clear in the last video when we were talking about out front tracks, the importance of that concept to try to get that centered sound. So I certainly hope that you experimented with that. When we talk about today, in this video, we're going to talk about an interaural processing trick technique that you can apply to the other concept that we talked about in the last video, but just to be very careful of phase issues. The closer tracks are together in panning, that when they're double tracks or two different tracks, the more phase issues you're going to have. You got you can pan things way all the way out right and left and put huge amounts of delay on between one track and another and not end up with a phasey sounding kind of thing with phase issues happening. The closer they get together, the more issues you'll have with phase that you have to take into consideration and listen for. So basically, this concept also is very simple. Normally, this concept is with a couple different tracks. So let's say that I've got this one track we talked about, that it's either a doubled track that I've done some work on the second track to make it sound like a different really cool capture from a different really nice microphone, or it's two captures of the same performance with two nice microphones. Doesn't matter either way. The concept here normally, that like I said in the last video that we talked about, panning is like 30-30 or 40-40 and things like that. But normally a lot of times this, besides trying to get that centered sound, is anything past 50 or 50. So, and we talked about, when we were talking about the interaural processing, we did in mixing concepts and at the end of first phase processing, that the interaural processing trick technique is a very simple concept. So we'll start at like 50% right and left. So at 50% right and left, that there's multiples that you want to work with of this. So the closer that they get together, let's say that you've got them panned out 100% right and left. So you can go up to 0.65 milliseconds of delay. That's the time it takes sound to get from one ear to the other for your brain to figure out what localization is. This side, the snap is louder over here, and there's a delay. So this here is, between this ear and this ear, your brain is going to figure out where the snap came from. Well, if you put delay on one side or the other, on one side or the other, and drop the volume of the other side, that it causes a localization problem, that your ear isn't getting the delay that it thinks it should, and it's not getting the volume difference that it thinks it should, so it starts to put the sound center. So what happens is you get this sound that it tricks the brain into thinking it's center, but it doesn't really perceive it as center. It perceives it as coming from some damn where that it doesn't know, and so it puts it center. Does that make sense? It's a very interesting technique. So basically, when you get into the DAW, the concept here, why this technique is important, is because it basically will add stereo field effect that causes your brain to picture a centeredness that causes width in the sound without adding a lot of delay to one track or the other. And that sounds funny, but you'll see in some of the next videos when we talk about larger delays and multiples of them as they get panned farther out, that it has a little bit different effect that doesn't cause it to have as wide a stereo effect, that keeps things a little bit more centered but still adds some stereo field without a huge stereo field being perceived. So I hope that makes sense, and that's about as clear as I can make it, because basically it's an aural trick that tricks the mind with localization that causes the brain to hear things somewhat centered, but a stereo field effect happening that doesn't normally cause confusion. It causes it to perceive a wide centeredness. And that's basically as simple as I can state it. So basically what happens, let's say I've got the track on the right side, and I've taken this and let's try with 100% right, 100%. So if I just go all the way right, if I go all the way right and I take this one and go all the way left, that I would start out with this one and that one with this process. I would start out with it. The one that's all the way right, the one that's all the way right and left is the delay on the one farthest left would get up to 0.65 milliseconds of delay. The one on the right would get a volume reduction of up to 0.5 dB. So the concept here is you might need a calculator for this and to figure out the multiples. Because if I go all the way right and left, I'm going to go on the left side, say 0.65 dB. Okay, and on the one that's panned to the right, I'm going to drop that minus, so another half a dB less than the one that's on less than the one on the left. So what this does is, like I said, is it's causing the delay effect, but with the delay effect, it's going to make it sound like what's happening on the right is a little bit louder because of the delay happening on the left. So you have to drop the volume of the one on the right a little bit. So as you come into 50% right and left, that you reduce that. So if I was like at 75% right and left, it would be half of those. So it would be the one on the right would be dropped down 0.25 of a dB, and this over here would be half of 0.65 milliseconds. And you basically just got a calculator, and it's very easy to figure out halves of what's happening there to get thirds and quarters and things like that. But it's a very simple concept. This concept basically, the whole idea of this concept is that what it does is it causes a centeredness. So your brain is basically not going to picture it centered, and it's not going to picture a stereo field happening, and from the other delays and things we're going to talk about in the next videos, but it pictures it as a centered wideness. So that may sound funny because there's really no words to put it, there's no really words for it, because it's a trick of the mind that tricks the ears, that uses the mind's localization tools to trick itself to cause a stereo field effect that has a really cool effect that you don't run into delay problems, so that you hear delay and phase problems, and you don't hear this really super wide stereo field, but it adds this thickness, width to whatever you're doing, to those two tracks. So it's a really cool effect to experiment with. So now when we get into pannings that are different, like let's say we're, right 40 here or something, we got right 40, and then here we got left 40, that when we're dealing with something like that, that these are, you're going to have to really fuss with these. I've found that for the most part, that a lot of times I might reduce the decibel level of the right side, let's say, very little. I mean, it might be 0.1 or 0.2, of a dB, which sounds ridiculous, but when you listen to it, you really have to sit back and listen if there's really any difference. Does that make sense? That you're looking for such minute differences that may or may not be perceivable. And when you get to the delays on that left-hand side, say we're going to delay on the left side, that they're very minuscule delays. It might be 0.2, 0.3, 0.5 it might be, it might be 0.1 millisecond or 0.2 or 0.3. I mean, it's there, or even minor, even less than that. If your dial will go like, really super minuscule amounts of delay. I know that sounds funny and it sounds ridiculous why you would do that, but it adds width. So basically, let's say that you were talking in that last video, trying to build that sound that we talked about in the last video, that it's going to add to that effect, that it's going to add even more width, but keeping it centered. Does that make sense? Which causes a really cool effect, and it really causes a unique texture to the sound. Now, as you get to 50% right and left and go out farther, that it adds more. When you see in the next video, we're going to talk about more multiples, meaning up to, there's a Haas effect that up to a certain point that the sound will sound like the same hit. And then after so many milliseconds of delay between two tracks or two sounds, it'll sound like two different hits. Underneath that you can come out with some really cool wide stereo effects. but it has a much more pronounced stereo field effect than this technique. This technique is a very cool technique because I found even if I take a track and I'm going to go 50% right and 50% left, and I'm going to go half of this 0.5 milliseconds on the left, and I'm going to drop this down in level from the one on the left in decibel level, like 0.25 dB, that it has this really interesting effect that it's like it causes this stereo effect that causes width, but it doesn't cause this huge stereo sound to where you can really sit back and hear the stereo effect happening. That it just causes this width, that those two sounds or those two different tracks start to blend together, that they have this, it has a blending effect that keeps things centered but also just makes it thicker and wider. So it's different than the other processing we're going to talk about. And like I said, it's really hard to relate that sound because basically I look around and talk to audio engineers and listen to the audio engineering community, and nobody's really come up with what you call that. What do you call that? Well, it's a trick that really is a very useful trick to really get some centered width. Does that make sense? That way that even if you pan things out, that it has much more of effect of sounding like the things we talked in the last video than stereo width, but makes it sound wider. So it's taking up more of the stereo field, and it sounds like it's taking up more of the stereo field, but it's really still in your face to where it doesn't sound like it's got this huge stereo field effect happening. And that's about the best way that I can state that. Basically, that whole technique and that trick you really need to practice with. And it's obvious. You really have to listen to it closely because it's not real obvious sometimes that it's happening. Does that make sense? But it is happening. And you will see that if you get used to using it and you really spend some time experimenting with it, that it is a very useful technique to really give a lot of width to what's going on, but not, get that stereo field width happening, that it's just adding, it's like taking a mono file and really adding a lot of width to it. Does that make sense? And when you start doing that processing, a little bit different processing, like I got two really nice different microphones, or you've processed the other take, or the double track a little bit differently so it sounds like another really nice microphone, that it has this really interesting effect on the mind to where it keeps everything centered, but it has more of the effect like we talked about in the last video of keeping things centered, but it also takes up much more of the stereo field and allows you to do that type of work without the listener really hearing that it's right and left. Does that make sense? That it more becomes this blended thing of those two tracks that's more of a wideness kind of effect happening. So that's another really cool technique for you to experiment with and really have fun with, to really keep things up front in your face, but thick and rich, and be able to do some really complex things like we talked about with a couple of different tracks or tracks taken with different microphones. So I hope you really sit down, ask me some questions if you have any questions about that, and basically it's one of those things you really just want to experiment with. So I really hope you enjoyed this fourth video in our subgroup mixing, and in the next video we'll talk about really getting some serious wide stereo width happening. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.